Before money, coins, cash, how did our economies work? Fundamentally, there's not that much that's different between those times and today. Economies are really only vectors for the transfer of value between different individuals. But there is one key distinction between the days before coinage and today, which marked a really seismic societal shift. Before, you could walk into a shop and give the shopkeeper some pieces of metal in return for a good. You would have to provide something of innate value to the shopkeeper. This is before the days of coinage. Maybe you were a blacksmith and you were proficient at making farming tools. You walk into the shop, but not with some coins and cash, but with a large shovel. The shopkeeper gives you a month's supply of grain, and in return, you provide him with a shovel. Both of you have traded value with each other, and it's a successful transaction. However, that interaction does seem very different to the kinds of transactions that we involve ourselves in today, in our age. Rather than walking into a shop with a shovel or some other kind of value-providing product, we can just trade some coins, notes, or even tap a card on a machine and receive an item of innate value in return. And this only works because the two parties involved in the transaction, the shopkeeper and yourself, trust that the money you're giving the shopkeeper holds equal value to the supply of grain that you're receiving. And that is why the invention of coinage was so revolutionary. Coinage was an incredibly important invention to the development of human society. The way I like to view coinage is that it's essentially a way for you to store the value that you have provided to society for later use. Say you worked 5 hours in the morning. You can use those hours that you worked to buy the grain that you need to from the shop in the afternoon. Another benefit of coinage is that you can work towards something that does not produce an item of physical value. Rather than everybody having to produce something that they can trade with on the spot, they can provide services, given that they know that they can be paid in money on the spot, rather than having to wait for a blacksmith, for example, to make a shovel for them to use. It also makes the transfer of value between people much easier to facilitate, because people don't always need to be in possession of items that hold innate value for other people. And as a result, human society was allowed to expand at a rapid rate from the old days, where trade in goods was the only way to do business. Without coinage, you would never be able to see the large empires of history, like Persia, China, or Rome, because coinage made it much easier to expand bureaucracy. Taxes, if paid in coins, meant that the state could spend its taxes on anything that they needed to get their hands on, since the people in those societies trusted the coinage that was being minted by their governments. And so the states could solve its problems faster than ever before, since they had a steady supply of value that they could use at any time to trade for the goods and services that they needed. But you might ask, why would these societies trust the coinage being minted by their governments? Usually this coinage was backed by something, and throughout history that was almost always precious metals. For example, the coins that were produced would contain a certain amount of silver or gold, which meant that the value of the coins was not completely invented or being artificially maintained by society. More recently, with the advent of national currencies like dollars, euros, or pounds, the state backed the cash and coins within a system known as the gold standard. Each specified portion of the national currency would be equivalent to the value of a certain amount of gold. In fact, in the past, you could go to your national bank and demand that they gave you gold equal to the value of the money you were handing to them. And in that way, those societies knew that the value of their money was not completely artificial, and therefore it was incredibly unlikely that the value of their money was going to immediately plummet at any given time. But there are also ways in which coinage produced risks to these societies involved. Let's take a look at a case study, for example. One of the things that governments could and still can do is devalue their currency. This essentially means that each portion of money in society is less valuable since it is being backed by less precious metals. And this was one of the things, for example, that slowly eroded the efficacy of the Roman Empire. It was really useful for the Roman state to devalue their currency because it meant that the state could therefore mint more coins. without having to increase the amount of silver that was being put into the coins. In fact, if you reduce the amount of silver in the coins, it meant that you could mint a lot more coins, which allowed the state, therefore, to spend a lot more when they ran out of money. But the major downside was long-term, where money was just no longer as valuable as it once was, and people no longer trusted the value of the coinage as much because it contained less precious metals. In the days of the Roman Empire, this devaluing was done by minting coins that gradually started consisting of less and less silver content, leading eventually to the coins being minted being worth screw all, meaning that Roman society no longer trusted their coinage. And this caused the old economic powerhouses of the empire, the towns and their forums, to no longer function conventionally, since the money that was traded was not trusted to be valuable by anybody anymore. And this led to lower levels of economic activity in towns and only made the empire poorer. And there are also lessons that we should learn from this for the modern day. As we speak, we are seeing the effects of governments abusing their monopoly in money printing rights. Inflation is running way too high, essentially meaning that the government is printing money at a rate which decreases the value of money within society. So while the government can always print more money to pay for everything that they need, people still have essentially the same wages as before and are therefore becoming poorer. But this was not something that governments could just do in the past. Let's go back to discussing the gold standard here. When governments used gold to back up their currencies, it was much harder to abuse money minting rights because the state knew that it needed a large enough quantity of gold to maintain trust in the value of money in society. But most governments actually came off the gold standard in the 20th and 21st centuries, since they were having trouble finding money to spend on a growing list of demands. And don't get me wrong, in the short term, this has absolutely skyrocketed people's standards of living, but the long-term effects are being felt by everybody now. Our money is no longer really backed up by anything. I know that you could make the argument that having a reserve of American dollars backs up your national currency, but at its roots, American dollars are just another form of artificial currency and therefore artificial value. And given the damaging effects that this is having on our prosperity within our societies, it really doesn't bode well for the future. I think that very soon we're going to realize that the small coins we have, those pieces of paper with symbols on them, and the numbers in our bank accounts no longer hold any real value. And that's going to be a disastrous day because it will completely change the way in which we facilitate our economic relationships with each other. Think about it. If you can no longer use money to buy things that you need, that just completely changes the world. The problem is that most people have a very sizable amount of their net wealth held as cash or money in bank accounts. And if money becomes worthless, then many people become significantly poorer. Essentially, I think people just have to prepare themselves for the tough times ahead. I believe the way in which we trade value with each other, the very nature of our economies and the way in which they work are going to change drastically in the next few years, and we need to be prepared. So I implore you to give that thought, the way in which you're going to respond to your money no longer being worth anything. There are dire times ahead, but I think if you prepare correctly, there are ways around this, and the world can continue to function in a somewhat normal state.